had one secret, just one. And for 53 years, I believed it would follow me quietly to my grave. But secrets have a way of surviving longer than the people who carry them. The day my granddaughter handed me that envelope, my heart stopped. Because the handwriting on the front was mine. From 1971. I was 17 when I made the worst decision of my life. I was 70 when I finally had to answer for it. Welcome to Whispering Heart's Voice, the place where real emotions find their words. My name is Gerald, and I am 70 years old. I have a good life, a warm home, grown children who love me, and grandchildren who fill my Sunday afternoons with noise and laughter. People in my town call me a decent man, a reliable man, and for most of my life, I believed them. But there is something I have carried since I was 17 years old, something I folded up tight and buried so deep inside myself that some mornings I almost forgot it existed, almost because, no matter how many years pass, some things refuse to stay buried. Last Tuesday, my granddaughter Emma came running in from the mailbox, holding a small brown envelope with no return address. She was smiling, completely unaware of what she was handing me. The moment I saw the handwriting on the front, my coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor. I had not seen that handwriting in 53 years. Where are you watching from today? And if this story already feels familiar, please stay with us. I stood there in my kitchen, frozen, staring at that envelope like it was something dangerous. Emma looked at me with worried eyes and asked if I was feeling all right, and I told her yes. Just a dizzy spell, nothing serious. She believed me. She always believes me. That is the thing about people who love you, they trust your explanations without question. I waited until she left the room before I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the envelope resting flat in front of me. My hands were trembling in a way they had not trembled since my wife Margaret's funeral 3 years ago. The handwriting was hers. I knew it immediately. The way you never forget the shape of letters, written by someone who once meant everything to you. Her name was Claire. We were both 17. And what happened between us that summer of 1971 was something I had spent an entire lifetime pretending never existed. I had never told Margaret. I had never told my children. I had never told a single living soul. But now, Claire had found me. After 53 years of silence, and something about that terrified me more than anything I could explain. I sat at that table for a long time without opening the envelope. I just stared at it, turning it slowly in my hands, feeling the slight thickness of whatever was folded inside. Part of me wanted to walk to the fireplace and drop it in, without ever reading a single word. I had built my entire life carefully, brick by brick, on the foundation of that one buried secret, and I was not ready to watch it crack. But another part of me, the part that had quietly carried this weight for 53 years, knew that I had always known this moment would come eventually. You cannot take something from someone the way I did and expect the universe to simply forget. I finally slid my finger under the seal and opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, and tucked behind it, something that made my breath completely stop. It was a photograph. A small, faded photograph of a baby, a newborn, wrapped in a white hospital blanket, with a tiny handwritten date stamped on the back in blue ink. August 14, 1972. My hands were no longer trembling. They had gone completely still, the way everything goes still, just before something enormous and unstoppable finally arrives. I turned that photograph over and over in my hands, studying every detail like it might somehow change if I looked long enough. August 14, 1972. I did the math without even trying, because some numbers burn themselves into your mind the moment you see them. Claire and I had been together in the summer of 1971. One summer, short, secret, and intense in the way that only young love can be. By September of that year, her family had moved away suddenly, and I told myself it was just one of those things that happens in small towns. People leave, life moves on. I was 17 and frightened and honestly relieved when she disappeared, because it meant I never had to face what we had done or what I had said to her in our final conversation. That last conversation haunted me for years afterward. I had told her that whatever happened, she was on her own. I had said those words to a 17-year-old girl who was clearly frightened, and then I had simply walked away and rebuilt myself into the good and decent man everyone believed me to be. But this photograph was telling me something I had spent 5 decades refusing to hear. Claire had not been alone after all. I unfolded the letter slowly, smoothing it flat against the kitchen table with my palm. The handwriting was slightly shaky, older than I remembered, but still unmistakably hers. She did not begin with anger. She did not begin with accusations. She simply began with 3 words that hit me harder than any insult ever could. She wrote, "Gerald. He knows." I read those 2 words 4 times before my eyes moved any further down the page. She explained quietly, in careful, measured sentences, that the baby in the photograph was a boy, that she had named him Thomas, that she had raised him completely alone, never married, working 2 jobs for most of her life to give him everything she possibly could. She wrote that Thomas had grown into a good man, a father himself now, with 3 children of his own. And then she wrote the sentence that made the entire room feel like it was tilting sideways beneath me. She wrote that Thomas had recently done one of those online ancestry tests, the kind my own grandchildren were always talking about, the kind that mapped your bloodline through a simple cheek swab. And somewhere inside that database, his results had connected directly to my daughter Susan. He had reached out to Susan 3 days ago. Susan, who had no idea any of this existed. I folded the letter carefully and sat in complete silence for what felt like an hour. Outside the kitchen window, I could hear Emma laughing at something on her phone in the next room. That bright, careless laugh that belongs only to the young and unburdened. I had been that once. A long time ago. Before one selfish summer and one cowardly conversation had quietly shaped the hidden architecture of my entire life. Susan was my eldest daughter. She was 48 years old, deeply loyal, and the child who had always looked at me with the kind of unconditional admiration that a father carries like a precious and fragile thing. She had her mother Margaret's eyes and my stubborn jaw, and she had delivered the eulogy at Margaret's funeral with such grace and composure that the entire church had wept openly. Susan believed in me completely, and now a stranger named Thomas had contacted her through a DNA website, introducing himself as something she had absolutely no framework to understand. I did not know yet what Susan had said to him. I did not know if she had told her brothers. I did not know if Thomas was angry or simply searching for truth, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was coming next, I had less than 72 hours before my entire family discovered who their father really was. I made myself get up from that table and move, because sitting still felt like slowly sinking. I walked to the window and watched the quiet street outside. The same street I had lived on for 31 years. The same neighbors waving from their driveways. The same elm tree Margaret had planted the year we moved in. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. And yet nothing in my world was even remotely the same anymore. My phone buzzed on the counter. I looked down and saw Susan's name on the screen. My stomach dropped completely. I let it ring 3 times, 4 times, telling myself to breathe, telling myself to answer naturally, telling myself to say nothing until I understood exactly how much she already knew. I picked up on the 5th ring. Her voice was calm, which frightened me more than tears would have. Susan only goes calm like that when she is holding something enormous very carefully. The way you carry broken glass with steady hands. She said, "Dad, I need to come over this evening. Something strange has happened and I think we need to talk face to face." She paused, and in that pause I heard 53 years of silence preparing to finally end. I told her yes, of course, come whenever she was ready. After I hung up, I sat down on the floor right where I was standing, because my legs simply refused to hold me anymore. The hours between that phone call and Susan's arrival were the longest of my life. I tried to eat something and could not. I tried to watch television and heard nothing. I walked from room to room in that quiet house, picking up photographs and putting them down again, looking at the faces of my family arranged across every shelf and mantelpiece like evidence of a life well lived. There was our wedding photograph, Margaret laughing with her head tilted back. So young and so completely trusting. There were the children, at various ages, gap-toothed and sunburned and gloriously unaware of anything complicated. And there was one photograph that I stopped at longest. A picture of Susan at about 8 years old, sitting on my shoulders at a summer fair, her small hands gripping my hair, her face absolutely radiant, with the kind of joy that only exists when a child feels completely safe with their parent. I had been her safety, her certainty, her solid ground, and tonight I was going to watch that change in her eyes, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:15. I straightened my shirt, ran a hand across my face, and walked slowly toward the front door, knowing with every step that the man who opened it would never quite be the same man who closed it again. Susan stood on the doorstep holding her handbag tightly against her side, which is something she only does when she is nervous. She stepped inside and kissed my cheek the way she always does, but her eyes were scanning my face with a careful intensity that told me she was already reading something there. We sat in the living room, the same room where this family had celebrated birthdays and Christmases and weathered Margaret's illness together. And for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then Susan reached into her handbag and placed her phone on the coffee table between us, screen facing up, showing a message thread with a name I had never seen written down before, but had carried silently in my chest for 5 decades. Thomas Whitfield. His opening message to Susan was polite and measured, introducing himself carefully, explaining the DNA connection, saying only that he believed they might share a biological father and that he was not looking to cause disruption, only to understand his own history. Susan looked at me steadily and asked the question in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air between us. She said, "Dad, do you know who this man is?" And I opened my mouth to say no, to reach for the denial I had rehearsed 100 times in my head that afternoon. But the word never came. The silence that followed was the most honest thing I had produced in 53 years. Susan watched my face and I watched hers, and somewhere in that wordless exchange, the denial I had rehearsed simply dissolved. I looked down at my hands resting on my knees, these old weathered hands that had built things and fixed things and held my children when they cried, and I told her yes. Just that one word at first. Yes. She did not react immediately. She sat completely still, the way deep water goes still before something rises from beneath it. Then she asked me quietly to tell her everything, from the beginning, leaving nothing out, and so I did. I told her about Claire, about that summer of 1971, the stolen evenings, the reckless joy of being young and certain that consequences only happened to other people. I told her about the last conversation, the one where I had said those unforgivable words and walked away. I told her about the relief I had felt when Claire's family moved away, and the shame I had buried beneath that relief like soil over something I could not bear to look at. I told her about 53 years of silence. When I finished, Susan stood up slowly, picked up her handbag, and walked to the window. She stood there with her back to me for a very long time, and I could see her shoulders shaking slightly. And I knew I had just broken something in her that had never been broken before. Susan did not turn around for a long time. When she finally did, her eyes were red but her voice was controlled in that frightening way of hers, steady and precise like someone carefully measuring every single word before releasing it. She said she needed to ask me one question and she needed the complete truth. She asked whether her mother had ever known. I told her no. Margaret had gone to her grave, never knowing a single word of it. And I watched something complicated move across Susan's face when I said that. Something that was equal parts grief and fury and a strange, terrible relief all tangled together. She sat back down across from me and told me that Thomas had been remarkably respectful in his messages, that he had made it clear he was not seeking money or recognition or any disruption to our family. He was a 53-year-old man who had simply spent his entire life not knowing where half of himself came from. Susan said that slowly and deliberately, letting each word land with its full weight. a 53-year-old man who had never known his father. I had grandchildren older than the age I was when I made that choice. And somewhere across this country, a man my own children's age had grown up with a shape in his life where a father should have been, a shape that was entirely my doing. Susan left that evening without giving me any clear indication of what she intended to do next, and that uncertainty was its own particular kind of torment. She hugged me at the door, briefly and carefully, the way you hug someone you are not yet sure how to feel about, and then she walked to her car without looking back. I stood in the doorway watching her taillights disappear around the corner, and the night felt enormous and very cold around me. I went inside and sat in Margaret's old armchair, the one nobody ever sat in anymore, out of some unspoken family agreement, and I talked to her. I do that sometimes, quietly, when the house gets too heavy with silence. I told her everything, the same way I had told Susan, and I asked her to forgive me for the secret I had kept through 39 years of marriage. The armchair said nothing back, of course, but sitting in it felt like the most honest conversation I had managed in decades. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, thinking about Thomas, thinking about a boy who had grown to a man, never knowing my name, living his entire life carrying half a history with no explanation attached. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, I made a decision that frightened me deeply, but felt, for the first time in 53 years, completely right. By the time pale morning light began creeping through the bedroom curtains, I had made up my mind completely. I was going to reach out to Thomas myself, not through Susan, not through a lawyer, not through any careful intermediary that might soften or filter or protect me from the full weight of what I had done. I was going to write to him directly, man to man, with nothing hidden and nothing rehearsed. I got up, made coffee, and sat at the same kitchen table where that brown envelope had shattered my comfortable world just 24 hours earlier. I opened my laptop, something my grandchildren had spent considerable time teaching me to use properly, and I found the email address Susan had quietly forwarded to me the previous evening without any accompanying message, just the address, sitting alone in my inbox like a quiet act of grace. I sat there for a very long time with my fingers resting on the keyboard, trying to find the right opening words. Every sentence I started felt either too formal or too desperate, too self-serving or too theatrical, because the truth was that there were no right words for what I had done. There was no combination of language elegant enough to justify 53 years of absence. So in the end, I stopped searching for the right words and simply wrote the true ones. And I pressed send before my courage had any chance to abandon me. The email I sent Thomas was not long. I had expected to write pages, to fill screen after screen with explanation and context, and carefully constructed remorse. But when the true words finally came, they were surprisingly few. I told him my name. I told him that I had received Claire's letter and that I had no right to ask anything of him whatsoever. I told him that I had been a coward at 17 and that the consequences of that cowardice had fallen entirely on the wrong people, on him and on his mother, to people who had deserved infinitely better. I told him I was not writing to excuse myself or to reclaim something I had forfeited long ago. I was writing simply because he deserved to hear directly from me that I knew what I had done, that I had always known, and that the comfortable life I had built on top of that buried secret had never once felt entirely clean. Because of it, I told him the decision about what happened next belonged completely to him. Then I closed the laptop and waited. 2 hours passed, then 3. I watched the morning move slowly across my kitchen floor the way light does when time feels suspended. Then my laptop made a small notification sound, and my heart responded with a single enormous lurch. Because Thomas Whitfield had replied, and his opening words were the very last ones I had expected him to write. Thomas wrote 3 words at the top of his reply before anything else. He wrote, "I forgive you." I sat with those 3 words for a long time before I could read any further, because something in my chest that had been wound tight for 53 years simply came loose all at once. And I am not too proud to admit that I wept at my kitchen table like I had not wept since the day I buried Margaret. When I finally composed myself enough to continue reading, Thomas told me his story in the same quiet, measured way his mother had written her letter, and I understood immediately where he had learned that particular grace. He told me about growing up with Claire, about the small apartment they had shared, about the way she had worked relentlessly to give him every opportunity she possibly could. He told me she had never spoken badly of me, not once, which broke something open in me all over again because it was far more than I deserved. He told me he had spent his younger years angry about my absence, then his middle years simply accepting it as the fixed condition of his life. But now at 53, with children of his own, he said he had arrived at a place where carrying that anger any further felt less like justice and more like a weight he was simply tired of holding. He said he was open to meeting, if I was willing, and he would let me choose the time and place. I read Thomas's email 4 times before I allowed myself to believe it was real. In all the scenarios I had imagined during that long sleepless night, forgiveness had not featured prominently among them. I had prepared myself for anger, for legal complications, for the kind of cold and justified fury that a man discovers when he finally locates the father who abandoned him before he was even born. I had not prepared myself for grace. I wrote back within the hour and told him yes, absolutely yes, I would travel to wherever he was, that the choice of location was entirely his and I would arrange everything around his comfort and convenience. He replied that he lived in Portland, Oregon, and that there was a small, quiet coffee shop near his home where he sometimes went on Saturday mornings when he needed to think clearly. He said that felt like the right kind of place for this particular conversation. We agreed on the following Saturday, 11 in the morning. I then did something I had not anticipated doing so soon. I called Susan and told her about the email exchange. She listened without interrupting, which for Susan is itself a significant gesture. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me considerably. She said she wanted to come with me to Portland, not to interfere, she said carefully, but because Thomas was her brother, and she had apparently already decided exactly how she felt about that. The week leading up to that Saturday moved, in a way that felt entirely disconnected from ordinary time, simultaneously to slow and alarmingly fast. I told my 2 sons, David and Michael, on the Wednesday evening, asking them both to come to the house together, because I did not have the strength to deliver this particular truth twice. They sat across from me at the dining room table. These 2 middle-aged men I had raised and coached and walked through their own heartbreaks, and I watched their faces move through disbelief and confusion and a complicated, shifting sadness as my words slowly rearranged the story they had always believed about their father. David, who is the quieter of the 2, said very little and stared at the table for most of it. Michael, who has always processed difficult things through motion, got up and walked to the kitchen and stood there for a long time with his back to us. Neither of them shouted. Neither of them stormed out. They were their mother's children in that regard, absorbing hard things with a steadiness that made me feel simultaneously proud and deeply unworthy. Before they left that evening, David asked one question that I had been asking myself for 53 years. He looked at me directly and said, "Dad, if Mom had known, do you think she would have stayed?" And I told him honestly that I did not know, and that not knowing was the thing I would carry to my own grave. Susan drove us to Portland on the Friday evening so we could stay overnight and arrive at the coffee shop rested and clear-headed rather than road-worn and anxious. We did not talk very much during the drive, which suited us both. Susan has always understood that some silences are not empty, but rather full of things that do not yet have words. And she has the rare gift of sitting comfortably inside that kind of quiet. We checked into a small hotel near the waterfront, ate dinner at a place neither of us would later remember clearly, and went to our separate rooms early. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a strange city outside my window, thinking about Claire, I had not yet responded to her letter beyond the email I had sent Thomas, and I knew that was something I still owed her. But that evening my thoughts kept returning to one particular image of her, 17 years old, standing at the edge of town with her family's packed car behind her, turning to look back at me one final time before she got in. I had watched her go from the end of my street and felt only relief. 53 years later, lying in a hotel room one city away from the son she had raised entirely alone, I finally allowed myself to feel the full shame of that relief without flinching away from it. Tomorrow was going to require me to be better than I had been then. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool, with a light rain drifting across the Portland streets, in that gentle, unhurried way that feels less like weather and more like the city quietly thinking. Susan and I walked to the coffee shop together, neither of us speaking much, our footsteps falling into an unconscious rhythm on the wet pavement. The place was exactly as Thomas had described, small and warm and unpretentious, with mismatched wooden chairs and the smell of good coffee settling over everything like a comfortable blanket. We arrived 5 minutes early and chose a corner table where we could see the door. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and watched people come and go. Ordinary Saturday morning people with ordinary Saturday morning concerns, completely unaware that at this particular corner table an entire family's history was preparing to rewrite itself. At exactly 11 o'clock, the door opened, and a man walked in who stopped my breath completely. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with gray threading through his dark hair and a careful, measured way of moving through a room that I recognized, with a shock so physical it felt like a hand pressed flat against my chest, because that walk, that particular unhurried, deliberate way of carrying himself through a space, was something I saw every single morning in my own mirror. Thomas stood in the doorway scanning the room, and then his eyes found mine, and for one suspended and eternal moment neither of us moved at all. Thomas walked toward our table slowly, and I stood up because sitting felt wrong for this particular moment, like receiving someone important while remaining deliberately small. He was taller than me by perhaps 2 inches, with Margaret's with Claire's quiet composure settled across his features like something carefully learned, rather than naturally inherited. Up close I could see the details that the distance had softened, the lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived fully and sometimes difficultly, the hands that he extended toward me that were unmistakably, undeniably shaped like mine. We shook hands first, which under any other circumstances would have seemed absurdly formal, but in that moment felt like the only honest place to begin. Then something shifted between us. Some invisible threshold crossed itself quietly, and I found myself holding this stranger who was not a stranger at all. This 53-year-old man who had existed in the world for his entire life, carrying the shape of my absence inside him. He did not pull away quickly, and neither did I. Susan was crying openly beside us, making no attempt whatsoever to hide it. When Thomas and I finally separated and sat down, he looked at me steadily across the table with eyes that held no anger, only something older and more complicated than anger. And he said quietly that he had spent a long time imagining what he would say when this moment finally arrived. We sat in that small warm coffee shop for nearly 3 hours, and somewhere inside the first 30 minutes the formality dissolved entirely and we simply talked, the way people talk when they have the enormous amount of catching up to do and are simultaneously terrified of rushing it. Thomas told me about his life in careful, generous detail, about the work he did as a civil engineer, about his wife Rachel who had stayed home that morning to give him space, but who he clearly spoke about with the kind of quiet pride that tells you everything important about a man's character. He told me about his 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and he pulled out his phone and showed me photographs with a naturalness that made my throat tighten considerably. They were beautiful children, bright-eyed and unruly-haired, completely unaware that somewhere across the country a 70-year-old man was looking at their faces for the very first time and understanding with full force exactly what his cowardice had nearly cost everyone. Sitting at this table, Susan asked questions I was too overwhelmed to think of. Practical, warm questions about schools and neighborhoods and holiday traditions. Building the framework of a relationship with a focus and intention that reminded me so powerfully of Margaret that I had to look away momentarily. Thomas noticed. He watched me collect myself quietly. And then he said something that neither Susan nor I had anticipated. He said he wanted me to meet his children, and he wanted them to know my name. The drive home from Portland felt entirely different from the drive there. Susan talked almost continuously, which is her way of processing joy rather than grief. Cycling through everything Thomas had said, every detail she wanted to remember, every moment she intended to tell her own children about. I sat in the passenger seat listening to her voice, fill the car, and watched the landscape move past the window and felt something I struggled at first to identify correctly because it had been absent for so long. It was lightness, a genuine and unfamiliar lightness, as though something that had pressed down on my chest every single morning for 53 years had finally, cautiously, begun to lift. But underneath that lightness, something else was quietly insisting on my attention. Claire Thomas had mentioned her only briefly during our conversation, telling us she was living in a small town in Vermont, that her health was reasonable for her age, that she knew he had come to meet me today and had given him her quiet blessing to do so. But she had not asked him to pass along any message to me, and that deliberate silence on her part felt significant and heavy in a way I could not ignore. I had written to her son, but not to her. I had sought forgiveness from the child, but not from the mother. And Claire, the 17-year-old girl I had abandoned without a single backward thought. I wrote Claire's letter by hand. That felt important somehow, necessary. The way certain things demand a particular form to carry their full weight properly. I sat at the kitchen table with good paper and a pen, and I wrote slowly and carefully, crossing out nothing, starting over twice when the words began arranging themselves into excuses rather than truth. The third attempt felt honest enough to send. I told her that I had met Thomas and that she had raised a man of extraordinary grace and decency, and that everything fine about him was entirely her doing and none of mine. I told her that I had thought about our last conversation more times than I could count across 53 years, and that the words I had said to her that day were the ugliest thing I had ever done. Uglier for how young and frightened she had been when I said them. I told her I was not writing to ask for her forgiveness, because I did not believe I had earned the right to ask that of her. I was writing only because she deserved to know that I had never forgotten, not for a single year, not for a single month, that there was a person in the world who had suffered the direct consequences of my cowardice while I went on living my comfortable and carefully constructed life. I sealed the envelope and addressed it in my best handwriting, and I drove to the post office myself rather than simply leaving it in the mailbox, because some things deserve to be delivered with at least that much intention. 3 weeks passed after I mailed that letter with no response, and I told myself that was entirely fair and required no explanation. Claire owed me nothing, least of all a reply, and I had written without any expectation of receiving one. I filled those weeks with the new and unfamiliar business of having Thomas in my life, exchanging emails, sharing photographs, arranging a proper family gathering for the following month where my children and grandchildren would meet their brother and uncle for the first time. David and Michael had both reached out to Thomas independently, which moved me more than I knew how to express, and watching those careful, tentative connections forming across the distance felt like watching something broken, slowly and imperfectly readjust itself into a new shape. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, 26 days after I had stood at that post office counter, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Small, cream-colored, with a Vermont postmark and handwriting that was slower and more careful than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. I brought it inside and sat in Margaret's armchair, and I held it for a long time before opening it. The way you hold something you understand might change you before you are entirely ready to be changed. Claire's letter was 4 pages long. The first 3 pages were the story of her life, written plainly and without drama. But it was the final page, the last paragraph especially, that I was completely unprepared for. Claire's final paragraph began with a sentence so simple and so devastating that I had to read it 3 times before it fully settled into me. She wrote, "Gerald, I stopped being angry at you somewhere around Thomas's 5th birthday, because I realized that anger was the one thing I could not afford to give my son." She told me that she had built a good life, not the life she had imagined at 17, but a real and meaningful one, rich with friendships and purpose and the profound daily privilege of watching Thomas become exactly the man she had hoped he might. She wrote that she did not need my apology, but that she was glad I had sent it, because it told her something she had quietly wondered about for 53 years. She said she had always hoped that somewhere, underneath the frightened boy who had walked away, there was a decent man trying to find his way toward the surface. Then she wrote the words that finally, completely, after everything, set me free. She said, "It seems he got there in the end." I folded that letter gently and held it against my chest and sat in Margaret's armchair in the late afternoon light. And I thought about all the years and all the silences and all the quiet accumulated cost of one summer's worth of cowardice. And then I thought about Thomas and Susan and David and Michael and the family gathering coming next month. And I understood that the story was not ending here. It was, after 53 years, finally and imperfectly and beautifully, just beginning.